Ukraine is going to be operating in and around Sevastopol by the end of next summer. So, I mean, the decisive phase of this campaign is probably going to start, I think, January, February, when Ukrainian forces are in position to begin that decisive phase, the liberation of Crimea. There's obviously no free, aggressive media that's going to challenge leadership in the Kremlin about what's being done. So yeah, I have to be a little bit skeptical about reports that come out. But even with that, there are more and more reports of people openly criticizing Putin. Uh, I saw today reports of mothers of recently mobilized soldiers openly protesting, but I can't tell yet how widespread that is. And we know that for centuries, this is not about Putin, but for centuries, Russian culture is a very brutal society. So the idea that thousands of men are going to be sent forward as cannon fodder is bad luck. I mean, that's what it is. And the so this kind of culture and type of society uh, is willing to put up with some of this to some point. I don't know where that point is. What I am trying to pay attention to is the emergence of power centers in Russia around Prigozhin, around Kadyrov, the Chechen, even General Surovkin, the new operational commander. I'm not sure he really takes his orders from the general staff. It seems almost he could have a direct line to Putin as well. So I'm trying to sort that out. Probably British intelligence has obviously a much clearer picture of that, but you don't get the impression that there is a coherent, functioning general staff where you've got people thinking strategy, operations, logistics, intelligence, all of those pieces. It's more of a little bit clumsier than that, but nonetheless. As a good Ukrainian friend of mine told me, he said the Russians need three things. They need people, they need fuel, and they need armor. And so even if the quality of those things is not real good, they still have a lot of it.
With looking at the latest move by the UK, which is to give Ukraine 3 Sea King helicopters. Now, as we well know, they are what the Royal Navy uses for anti-submarine warfare. So how significant is this military contribution, and does it speak to a change in the stage that this war is entering?
Well, as usual, the UK is out in front, leading in terms of what it provides to Ukraine. The UK has consistently been a step ahead of the US, and then the US catches up on giving certain types of capabilities, and this is important. In this group of 50 nations that are part of the Ukraine contact group, many of the nations wait and see what the US, the UK do before they feel confident enough to do it themselves. So if for no other reason, this is important. Secondly, given anything that helps Ukraine improve their transport capability, whether it's for medical evacuation or protecting their coast or moving capabilities around, that's going to be important. And I think this is the first time anybody has provided manned aircraft or aircraft that would be manned to Ukraine. I hope that this opens up possibilities for the U.S. and others to do the same.
Do you think this, in particular, is looking towards a view to Ukraine being able to retake Sevastopol, or am I jumping 3 steps ahead here?
That's actually a great point. I hadn't. You're a step ahead of me. Um, I would imagine that Ukraine would have conveyed to the UK um, that there are requirements, things that they need, and it could be an anticipation of needing a particular maritime capability like that. For sure, in my view, Ukraine is going to be operating in and around Sevastopol by the end of next summer. So, I mean, the decisive phase of this campaign is probably going to start, I think, January, February, when Ukrainian forces are in position to begin that decisive phase, the liberation of Crimea.
And since we're talking about Western military contributions, I know there's a big conversation stateside about whether the Pentagon should hand over Grey Eagle attack drones that could be armed with Hellfire missiles to Ukraine. So far, the US hasn't wanted to do that. Do you think that might change? And why is Washington holding back? Is it political, don't want to kind of escalate the war, or is it more technical, not wanting that technology to fall into the hands of the Russians?
Well, number one, I absolutely hope that our policy will change and that the U.S. will provide those capabilities. I mean, I don't know how much more we have to watch Ukrainian civilians getting murdered by these missiles that are slamming into apartment buildings and hospitals and maternity wards and that sort of thing. What else we have to see to realize that the Russians are going to keep doing this until they are stopped, either by running out of their own weapons or until they are literally stopped. It is the Russian strategy now, because they're losing basically on the ground and on the sea, to do everything they can to drag this war out, to protract it until the point that we would lose the will to continue supporting Kyiv. And so I think to answer the other part of your question, there's been a hesitation on the part of the White House out of concern that if certain capabilities were provided, or if we enabled Ukraine to hit targets inside Russia, legitimate sovereign Russian territory, that might lead to some kind of escalation. I think that's less of a concern now, in my view, than it was a few weeks ago, because it appears to me that the threat of Russia using a nuclear weapon has subsided significantly, because they realized that President Biden was not bluffing, that there would be catastrophic consequences if Russia used a nuclear weapon. That doesn't mean there's no risk, but I think it's subsided. And the fact that President Xi made it clear that this was unacceptable, I think that also had an impact. So whatever it was that we were worried about in terms of escalation seems to have gone away. Now there is a some thinking that China has, because of the Shanghai Agreement, has some sort of agreement with Russia that if Russia itself was attacked and that we had anything to do with it, that China would be bound to help respond in some way. And so there is a huge advantage to making sure that China does not become a supplier or an active participant in any way. But that's right there, that is me speculating.
We've heard in recent days from Anton Heroshenko, an advisor to Ukraine's Ministry of Internal Affairs, the claim that Russia is planning a further mobilisation of potentially 700,000 troops, possibly in January. Does that sound right to you? And if that were the case, what would that mean for the battlefield in Ukraine?
Mm-hmm. Well, it certainly sounds plausible that they would be thinking about that. There are a lot of people in the Kremlin who are extremely unhappy with how poorly, not just the Kremlin, but the talking heads around the Kremlin, that are extremely unhappy with how the war has gone thus far. The withdrawal from Kherson, for example, I mean, that really has raised a lot of criticism. And so people are calling for another mobilization. Now, I would say if they're already talking about that, we're going to see another mass exodus of military-age males from Russia into Kazakhstan, Georgia, and anywhere else they can go, much like we saw back in September, where about 500,000 military-age males got out of Russia before they could be mobilized. What we're seeing so far from the performance of these recently mobilized soldiers, of course, they're untrained, poorly equipped, poorly led when they show up. But over time, I mean, if you're there, you can get better. And so Ukrainians, I think, Ukrainian armed forces are going to do everything they can to keep the pressure on Russian forces so that these recently mobilized troops don't have the chance to get better. Keep the pressure on them. If there are several 100,000 more that somehow turn up with equipment and uniforms and get to the fight, yeah, of course, that presents a challenge. But already we can see I mean, you've seen it. All the anecdotal evidence of newly mobilized soldiers being handed equipment that's from the 1940s and 50s. So where is the stuff going to come for where is the stuff going to come from for another tranche of one, two, three, 500,000, however many it is? I'm sorry for the long answer, but um, it it won't be helpful for Ukraine if several hundred thousand more newly mobilized soldiers show up. But I would be skeptical that they'll actually turn up, and I'm not sure that the population is going to be willing to see that through as well. We still have a lot of it.
Yes, that is fascinating. And what about the Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov saying this week that his country does not intend the special operation, as Russia has framed it, to change the government in Ukraine? In some ways, it seems another climb down in the aims that the Russian government had at the beginning of this invasion in February. Should we take that at face value, though?
Well, I don't know if Mr. Peskov is a credible source anymore. I mean, he gets about 10 Pinocchios every time he opens his mouth, and I think, of course, they're having to change the stated objectives because of their own population. I mean, I think that's the targeted audience. It's pretty clear that I think they realize they're not going to influence what we think about them in terms of restated objectives. They've got to keep their own side in play. Dr. Timothy Snyder, who's an expert on the region and who I follow very closely, he said, yes, it's terrible for the Kremlin to lose in Ukraine. It's much worse to lose in Russia. And so at some point, these various power centers are going to realize that there is no positive outcome for them. Zero. There is no positive outcome for them in Ukraine. So the sooner, you don't want to be the last guy being loyal to the dictator if he's going to fall. So I think there's going to be a lot of really tough power struggles, if you will, of some sort in Russia over the next 6 months. It feels like it's already happening, but it's not burst out onto the surface yet.
Interesting. Do you think that could drive Putin to try and negotiate, find some sort of off-ramp that he can end the conflict, but also sell it to his own people, whether that's trying to do a deal to give back the Donbass but keep Crimea, for example?
Of course, I think they would love to get a negotiation going right now.
So you think that's credible? Because that to me is interesting that you think that, because I know that there's skepticism from some quarters.
The Russians want a negotiation because if they can do that, if they can freeze what they have, that with their occupation of Crimea and parts of the Donbass, if that's the start point for negotiation, then they've already won. Which is why I thought it was my good friend and former boss, General Milley, to even suggest that maybe now's a good time for Ukraine to think about negotiating, regardless of the context of how he said it. That's oxygen to the Kremlin, which got to hang in there a little bit longer because obviously the Americans and others are getting weary of this, or it's becoming expensive, or whatever. And so this is 100% the call of President Zelensky on whether or not Ukraine is ready to negotiate. And I spoke to a Ukrainian friend the other day who said if his estimate was that if President Zelensky said, all right, tomorrow we're going to open up negotiations with the Kremlin, that there would be a riot outside his office within minutes because Ukrainians have paid such a price already. And they can also sense that they're close to winning, that there's very little appetite, I think, for negotiating anything at this point. Not until after Russia has been compelled to leave Ukraine, including all of Crimea, which is sovereign Ukrainian territory. And let's not forget, there are about 1.5 million Ukrainian citizens, including hundreds of thousands of children, who have been kidnapped and deported from Ukraine to Russia. So how could you possibly expect Kyiv to negotiate while you've not only do the Russians occupy a lot of their critical territory, including most of the seaports that would be essential for any sort of economic rebuilding for Ukraine, but also over 1 million of their people that have been kidnapped in a way that would make Stalin proud.
And just finally, I'm interested talking to British members of Parliament that some are just beginning to report constituents, voters in the UK, beginning to unprompted bring up the amount of money that the UK is contributing in terms of military aid to Ukraine, and sort of saying, well, look, that we support Ukraine, but is it right to be giving that money at a time when, Brits are facing such a cost of living squeeze, having trouble paying their energy bills, affording to put food on the table? Do you think that Western resolve will make it through this winter, or do you think we will start to see populations beginning to question the amount of support and money and financial aid that the Western nations are giving Kyiv?
Yes and yes. As Gary Kasparov said, this is the last winter that Russia will be able to ruin our economies or use energy as a weapon, because what they've done has caused Europe to accelerate its movement away from dependence on Russian gas anyway. I live here in Frankfurt, Germany. Germany's 100% full capacity on gas. They got serious, and the Germans, although months ago I was hearing a lot of whining about, oh my God, this is going to be terrible, they got serious about it, and now it's like, yes, it's going to be expensive, but we'll get through this. So I think the Kremlin played their gas card way too early, and Gary Kasparov is correct. This is the last winter, so that's important to keep in mind. The other part of this, though, is as long as our elected officials, Prime Minister, President, members of Parliament, members of Congress, can explain to their constituents why this matters, then I think actually most people understand that this is important and it's something we have to do. This is not charity for Ukrainian people. As much as I love Ukraine and as much as I have good Ukrainian friends that I love dearly, that's not a reason to spend $40 billion or provide all these things. This is about stability and security in Europe, which is an essential element for prosperity in Europe. And America's prosperity is directly tied to European prosperity. Europe is our most important trading partner. So for that reason alone, it's important that Russia is stopped. And I think, I can't believe that any serious thinking person believes that Russia will say, okay, we just wanted Crimea, we're good, that's it. In 2 or 3 years, they'll be back at it. Because they have seen in 2008, we did nothing after they invaded Georgia. We did nothing really after 2014 when they invaded Ukraine the first time and seized Crimea and illegally annexed it. We did precious little after they shot down an airliner full of hundreds of Dutch citizens and others. We did nothing after they jumped over President Obama's red line in Syria. So why in the world should we expect that they'll be satisfied that all along we just wanted Crimea? I mean, that's to ignore Russian history and everything that comes out of the Kremlin. And then finally, China is watching this. And if the Chinese see that European and American and Canadian resolve buckles under some economic challenges that we're having right now and stop supporting Ukraine, and we can't stop Russia. Tomorrow is 9 months since Russia's invasion, and they're in worse place now than they were when they started. And if we can't stop that, then I don't think the Chinese will be terribly impressed with anything that we say about holding them accountable. Respect for international law, freedom of navigation, and this international order from which the US and the UK and other Europeans have benefited.
Brilliant. I know I said that was the last question, but there's one more thing I'm dying to ask you, so let's call this a bonus. Looking ahead to the next few months, is there anything else we should be watching out for in terms of Russia's retaliation against the West? There's been allegations of cyber attacks recently, sabotage of gas pipelines. What should we be watching out for?
Well, I think that they're going to threaten the use of nuclear weapons, but as we've already talked about, I think that's extremely unlikely. I think they're going to do things to try and distract, to cause people to be worried. There's always rumors about another front opening in Belarus. I think that is a total distraction. Um, I think that they actually are reluctant to use cyber to the extent that they have it because they know that the UK and the US could literally crush them with our own offensive cyber capabilities from the US and from UK. I think that they know that. And so there's a deterrent effect, if you will, that's there. And I think, there are people around Putin that see that, okay, he's 70 years old, he won't be around forever. And they're thinking about life after him and after this conflict. And the idea of trying to get back to some sort of normal. I mean, all these guys that own really nice property in Belgravia, for example, and, and other places in the U.S. and in the Bahamas, they'd like to be able to get back to that. And as long as they continue on the path they are now, it's never going to happen. I mean, I can't even imagine name a Russian that's not in jail that is anywhere in power or near power. I can't even imagine any of them ever being invited to a reception or an international meeting or anything. I was in The Hague recently. I work for Human Rights First as a senior advisor, and we're very interested in accountability. And The Hague is literally on the case. I mean, I think we're going to start hearing announcements in the next couple of months about investigations into genocide and specifically the deportation of these hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian kids. So hard to imagine anybody that has any sort of influence being welcomed back into normal society.